Hello, everyone, and Happy New Year. Welcome back to StatTech Researchers Seminar Series on Measuring Progress and Well-Being. So I'm Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers. Today we are pleased to be in hybrid mode with our very own Francesco Sarracino, who will discuss when does economic growth improve well-being. Before we get started, a quick reminder, the deadline to submit your abstract to the third annual Measuring Progress workshop is in less than 2 weeks on the 15th of February. If you missed the announcement, the workshop will take a similar format as in previous years and occur on the 18th and 19th of June 2026. Andrew Oswald and Ida Kubashevsky will serve as keynotes, and you can see further details on the website. Back to today, Francesco will speak for around 40 minutes and then address questions at the end, at which time please raise your virtual hands or post your questions in the chat. During the presentation, please keep your microphones muted. As a last reminder, we are recording the event. You'll be able to find this and past recordings on our website and YouTube channel. Now to introduce Francesco Sarracino. Many of you know him, of course, but perhaps there are still a few highlights you're unaware of. So Francesco serves as Deputy Director of StatTech Research and leads the unit on well-being and entrepreneurship. He is an invited professor at the University of Strasbourg and a co-editor-in-chief of the newly created Journal of Well-Being Economics. He is a member of the World Wellbeing Panel and of the Board of Directors of the International Society for Quality of Life Studies. His work, focusing on evidence-based policy to promote socially and environmental sustainable development, has been published in prestigious scientific journals, including Nature Human Behavior, World Development, Ecological Economics, the Journal of Happiness Studies, and others. He and his work have been covered by numerous local and international media outlets, and it is a real pleasure to have you here today, Francesco Sarracino, in person. Without further ado, Francesco, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's great to share with you some of the work that many of you actually have contributed to. So I hope I will do a good job in sharing this with our broad audience. In the next few minutes together, I will try to deliver 3 key messages. The first one is economic growth is not always good. How we produce matters for well-being. The second point is that when the outcome of this growth is unequally distributed, then it will more likely increase social comparisons, erode social capital, and reduce well-being. And the last point that I will try to make is that well-being should be the primary goal of decision-making. In order to deliver these 3 points, I've organized the presentation in the following parts. I will skip the first point because I assume that you are all familiar with subjective well-being and its measurement, and I will directly dig into the relation between subjective well-being and economic growth. I will then go quickly over the trust paradox to introduce some of the conditions when economic growth might not benefit well-being, and illustrate some evidence of possible individual level explanatory mechanisms, before leading towards the conclusion where I will try to make the point that we should prioritize well-being in decision-making. Before I go deeper into the presentation, just you're welcome to interrupt me if I'm going too fast or if you have any urgent or clarificatory questions. And otherwise, there will be time for additional questions at the end. Another disclaimer, I will gloss over a lot of methodological details with the purpose of delivering the key messages. But you're welcome to ask me more details at the end of the presentation on these aspects. All right. First point, economic growth is not always good. How we produce matters for well-being. In a study to which I contributed to together with Chiara Peroni and Jean-Marie Di Maria from the Statistical Office of Luxembourg, we asked, if you want, a simple question: whether, to what extent, subjective well-being is an output of the production process or an input of the production process. We analyzed the various European countries over about from early 2000 to 2010. And what we found is that in most of the cases, subjective well-being is never an output of economic activity. In the box and whisker diagram that you see just in the middle of the slide, you see that there are only a couple of countries and country years, I must be more precise, when we record a significant contribution of the economic activity to the creation of life satisfaction in this case. And these are Estonia and Slovenia prevalently. On the other hand, we found that in most of the cases, most country years, and this is the diagram on the right, we observe a significant contribution of well-being to the economic production. This result is the one that I usually refer to if you heard me already saying that increasing life satisfaction by 1 unit would deliver efficiency gains that are equivalent to nearly 80 working hours per year. And this is not a surprising result, because there is by now a huge evidence coming from a variety of studies at different levels with different methods that have shown how subjective well-being, either measured like life satisfaction, life expectations with experiments, contributes to productivity in various ways. And this table just summarizes some key results. For instance, in a study published in 2022, Chiara Peroni and colleagues estimated that increasing by 1 unit job satisfaction and job quality at industry level in European countries would correlate with nearly plus 5 percentage points in productivity and 6 percentage points increase in productivity growth. More recently, Martijn Burger and colleagues, Martijn was our last speaker, if I'm not mistaken. It was the one before the last one. And he was speaking exactly about the role of well-being for productivity. Well, his latest study identified that an increase by 1 unit in life satisfaction across regions in Europe correlate with an increase in by 17% in TFP, total factor productivity. Okay, so this result is not surprising, but what is controversial here is the observation that economic production does not deliver better lives. And this should be surprising, because what's the point of organizing our processes efficiently if they do not make our life more comfortable, more pleasant, more enjoyable? Well, this point is the heart of the Easterlin paradox. The relation between economic growth and subjective well-being is the matter of the Easterlin. It was first discovered by Professor Easterlin in 1974, and since then has been analyzed extensively, I would say, until the point when I think we have reached a sort of consensus about its meaning and its implications. What it is, the Easterlin paradox, so that we make sure we are all on the same page. The Easterlin paradox arises from the contradiction between two kinds of evidence. The first one is a cross-sectional evidence. Here on the x-axis, we have GDP per capita, and on the y-axis, we have a measure of subjective well-being. In this case, it's life evaluation as taken by the Gallup World Poll. And what we see is that, on average, countries that are richer are also those where people tend to report higher life evaluation. And we also see that there are decreasing marginal returns from additional GDP. And this is what we would expect from Economics 101. But this is just the first part of the paradox. Here, there is nothing surprising. The paradox arises when we take this evidence and we make the inference that increasing GDP, that is to say economic growth, increases well-being, that is to say raises subjective well-being. This relation is about time series, and it is what you see in this slide now. On the y-axis, now I have the yearly growth rate of GDP per capita. Above the zero, to the right of the zero, the economy is growing. Below the zero, the economy is shrinking. And the same goes on the y-axis. There I have changes in life evaluation. above the zero, life evaluation is growing, below it is decreasing. And each dot on this scatter plot represents a country. And it's the meeting point of two growth rates. What we see is that there is quite a line of that there is quite a cluster of countries that concentrate along the zero line, indicating that these are countries where the economy is growing, but we do not register significant increases, neither positive nor negative, in subjective well-being. This is the Easterlin paradox. Over time, economic growth does not durably increase subjective well-being. But this is not all the story, because you see that the scatter plot is actually quite spread. And although on average, we see that there is no relation, there are countries like the green dots where, where the economy grows, but also life satisfaction, life evaluation is increasing. And there are also countries like the red dots where the economy is growing, but life evaluation is regressing. The Easterlin paradox does not hold only in specific countries at specific over specific periods of time. It also changes within countries. To make this point, I take the example from Japan, from a study to which Kelsey and I contributed to a few years ago. Now, the solid black line in this diagram shows the GDP per capita in Japan from 1980 to 2010. And you see that between 1980 and 1990, GDP per capita in Japan nearly doubled. At the same time, however, if we ask Japanese people how they felt about their life in that decade, we would see that their life satisfaction, if did not decline, at least it stagnated. So this is a clear example of Easterlin paradox. But look at the following decade, 1990-2000. GDP keeps increasing, but at a much slower pace, as it is indicated by the lower slope of the curve. This is the period that most economists label the lost decade because of the slowdown in economic growth. However, again, if we ask how Japanese feel about that time, that's the gain decade, because their life satisfaction jumped up. So economic growth and, well, the relation between economic growth and subjective well-being is not straightforward. It can change depending on the time and depending on the year. So this raises the question, is it possible that this relation, what is changing this relation? And the point that I will try to introduce now is that unequal distribution of growth is more likely to increase social comparisons, erode social capital, and reduce well-being. In fact, the evidence that I try to deliver so far indicates that economic growth does not work in the same way everywhere. Now, economic growth is the result of economic activity, and economic activity is basically the result of a factor of production, but also of institutions, values, culture, interaction among people, and interaction between individuals and the natural environment. The way we organize economic activity matters for the way we produce and eventually consume. So this is what I mean when I say that the quality of economic growth matters, because the way we organize that production can be beneficial or detrimental to human well-being. The question then is not if, but under which conditions economic growth can benefit well-being. And on the other way, the other side of the hand is which conditions we should avoid in order for economic growth to hamper well-being. This question is very important for public policy. And that's why we, especially if you are economists, should be concerned about this issue. Now, what are these conditions? There can be a situation that that can, for instance, take place in presence of economic growth and can be harmful for well-being. For instance, we know that trust, social capital in general, is very important for people's well-being. Now, if economic growth erodes trust, then it may end up reducing human well-being. What is the relation between economic growth and trust? This is a great question that has been at the center of, at least, I would say, fairly in the center of the literature on development economics. Why? Because most literature agrees that that trust is a catalyst of economic interactions. You see this position clearly represented in the diagram on the left of this slide, where you see the cross-sectional relation between GDP per capita on the x-axis and trust in others on the y-axis. And you see that countries where trust is in general higher are also countries tend to be richer and vice versa. This is rather intuitive in economics. The main argument is that trust in others and social capital in general reduces transaction cost, makes work relations smoother, reduces the principal agent problems. In any way, the idea is that trust and social capital in general free resources that can be reinvested in the economic activity, thus boosting it. However, again, this relation holds in cross-section. Does it mean that increasing GDP will also raise trust over time? Well, the answer is intuitively reported on the right-hand side of this slide, where the dashed line represents the share of people trusting others in 90 developed and developing countries worldwide. And the solid line shows the world GDP, the GDP in the same countries over time. So we see that countries are getting richer on average, but trust is eroding. And if you are concerned that this result is hiding a lot of heterogeneity, then this chart allows you to go a little bit deeper. Here we see the trajectories, the trends of participation in groups and associations, trust in others, confidence in national institutions, for countries in the G7 on the left-hand side and BRICS countries on the right-hand side. So in both cases, we see a deterioration of social capital. We investigated, Julia and I investigated whether there is a causal relation between economic growth and trust in a paper published last year. And I don't want to bother you too much with econometrics, but what I want you to retain here is basically the sign and magnitude of the coefficients in these three columns. The three columns reflect three different methodologies to analyze the relation between GDP per capita and trust over time, from a standard OLS fixed effects to a two-stage first difference. And we see that independently from the method, we find a negative and significant coefficient, which indicates that increasing GDP by 1 percentage points would decrease trust in others. By how much? Well, if we choose, for instance, the intermediate coefficient of -18, that would mean that trust is declining by nearly 2 percentage points per year. That is to say, a growth rate of 1% per 10 years would decrease trust by nearly 2%. These numbers track rather well what we observe in real data, like in the United States, for instance. So we have evidence that economic growth can erode, actually erodes trust in others. But why is this happening? One possible explanation is the increase in income inequality. In this case, just to show you the result intuitively, we see the trend for United States. We have the square and the rhombi represents GDP per capita in the United States. The dark colored ones are years when inequality in the United States is below the average, and the bright squares are periods when inequality is above average. And then we contrast this relation with what is happening to trust in others, which are the pale dots approximated by those linear relations. So what we see is that in the first period, between 1980 and early 2000, the relation between trust and GDP was nil. Trust was not really declining, and GDP was growing. That was a period characterized prevalently by inequality below the average. However, subsequently, the economic growth, American economic growth, became characterized by increasing high income inequality, which is when we start observing the erosion of trust, of which we mostly speak in the literature these days. There are various reasons that can explain why income inequality can erode trust. The reason is that, for instance, in highly unequal society, people tend to compete stronger for scarce resources, and competition crowds out the willingness to cooperate and to trust others. Also, in societies that grow more polarized, the opportunity to share common experiences and to build shared understandings decline, thus reducing the possibility to create conditions to trust others and to create social cohesion. Lastly, in a study published a few years ago, Giulia, Stefano, and others had showed that social capital is substitute of social comparisons in people's well-being. Now, social comparison is, if you want, a measure of envy. Is how much I get compared to what you get. And when the society grows unequal, the possibility to establish this kind of comparisons increase. If social comparison is substitute of social capital, this means that when inequality increases, I lose incentive to invest in social relations in favor of focusing on social comparisons. So social comparison, inequality through social comparison is crowding out investment in trust in others and in social capital. We investigated the possible mediating role of inequality more systematically in a paper published in 2017 by I mean Małgorzata Mikucka and Josh Dubrov. In that paper, we investigated 30 years of time series. We considered 48 developing and transition countries, and we adopted a multi-level regression model that allowed us to control at the same time for the levels of GDP, of trust, and of inequality, for the changes over time of GDP, trust, and inequality, and their interaction with social capital. What did we find? Now, I will not show you the table behind this because it's not, it would not be fair at nearly at 6 p.m. in the afternoon. But I will try to tell you the story with a picture. In this diagram, let's start by the area. The area is color-coded. The green, the more the green, the more positive is the association between economic growth and well-being over time. The more red, the more negative is the relation between economic growth and well-being over time. So this diagram allows us to read how the relation between economic growth and well-being changed in a specific country over time in function of two variables: the changes in trust, which you find on the x-axis. Above zero, trust is increasing. Below zero, trust is decreasing. And changes in income inequality on the y-axis. Again, above the zero, inequality is rising. Below zero, inequality is decreasing. And then what we can do is to plot various countries. In this case, I'm showing China because China was a particularly interesting case at the time. In 1990, China was substantially a poor rural country that, on top of 20 years, has experienced a dramatic industrial revolution that brought it to be a preeminent player in the international sphere. This unprecedented growth should have affected people's well-being, right? So what happened in China? In China in 1990, people were in a situation where economic growth, as little as there was compatible with people's well-being. However, progressively, with the passing of time, China moved on and on. China moved on and on northwards in the region that becomes more and more red, indicating that over time, economic growth in China became more and more decoupled from well-being. Why is this happening? Well, we record moderate changes in trust. As you can see on the x-axis, China is not really moving much compared to changes in trust. But we see an explosion in inequality. In 1990, our change in income inequality was minus 10 over the period in the long run. But in 2012, it was plus 10. Inequality has exploded in China in those 20 years. The good news is that more recent data show that inequality is calming down, and this is bringing up the well-being of Chinese people. But so this should give you intuitive evidence that inequality can play a big role in the relation between economic growth and well-being. What are some of the individual level mechanisms that can explain this relation? This is a table again coming from the famous paper I mentioned earlier with Giulia and Stefano Bartolini. Why am I bringing this up? Because it offers a good overview over the key relations I'm talking about here. Here we have three separate data sets in the three columns, the EU SILC, the World Value Survey EVS, and the SOEP. We have also two different regression methods. In the first two cases, these are OLS, and in the last case is a fixed effects, right? And then the authors used the Lubel method to try to estimate the direct effect. But what I want to show is that also we have two measures of social comparisons. Reference income, which is my income compared to yours, and social class, which is a self-reported evaluation of my position in society. And we see that independently from the measure we use of social comparisons and the survey, these measures always attract a negative coefficient. So we know, and this is not surprising, that social comparisons are bad for human well-being. The other point that I want to show, however, is that when we interact a measure of social capital with these two measures, we find positive and significant coefficients, which is the evidence supporting the earlier claim that social capital and social comparisons are substitutes. When one increases, the other decreases, and vice versa. So this evidence lends support to the view that indeed to some of the mechanisms through which economic inequality might explain why economic growth erodes well-being when inequality increases. All right, what's next? Now, the implication of this study is that if there is a trade-off between social capital and social comparisons, then what we should expect is that the relation between income and well-being should be stronger in countries where social relations are scarcer. Why? Well, because if social capital moderates the relation between social comparison and well-being, what happens is that when social capital is higher, social comparison should play a lesser of a role, and therefore the difference in well-being between rich and poor people should be smaller. And this is what the chart is showing. In this case, we have countries worldwide organized by share of people trusting others on the x-axis, and life satisfaction gap between rich and poor people on the y-axis. And we see how the Scandinavian countries that are traditionally those where trust in others is higher are those where the difference in life satisfaction between rich and poor people are smaller. We see a similar result also in Luxembourg. Luxembourg, this is the share of people very satisfied with their life, and is reported in the solid line here. So we see that from 2009 till nowadays, life satisfaction has been slightly declining. And on the dashed line, you see the gross national income per capita. And then I used the dots and the triangles to identify those years when inequality increases and when inequality is decreasing. And what we see is that also in Luxembourg, the changes in life satisfaction tend to be accompanied to periods when inequality is increasing. We see it rather clearly. Well, this is the first period. The gray bars indicate the areas of major economic downturns. So we have the 2008-9 crisis that in Luxembourg hit a little bit later. And then we have the pandemic 2021-22. But then we see that after the first period of the 2008 crisis, life satisfaction started declining, being characterized by, despite economic growth, and that period is a period characterized by increasing inequality. Then inequality slows down, and well-being is picking up, and so on and so forth. So far, I've been putting the emphasis on inequality and trust as two moderating factors, because these are those on which I put more attention. But the literature has uncovered also other possible mechanisms. And I want to emphasize that we are just at the beginning of investigating which conditions can change the relation between growth and well-being. And here in this table, I'm just showing a sample of recent papers that study various mechanisms, including employment, welfare state, social safety nets, and health in the most recent paper by Oparina and colleagues. Let's now move to the third point. How am I doing with time?
I'd say 5 to 10 minutes left.
I'm concluding. The third point is well-being should be the primary goal of decision-making. So what does it mean to prioritize well-being in decision-making? Based on the evidence I showed so far, I hope I managed to convince you that investing in social relations and reducing income inequality are two mechanisms through which we can make economic growth compatible with people's well-being. But in general, the point that I want to make is that this evidence suggests that we should investigate and adopt policies to target well-being directly, rather than investing resources in reanimating economic growth in the hope that its benefits will eventually trickle down on humans' well-being. Let's target directly well-being in policymaking, and then we will see what will happen to growth. The other point is we should introduce well-being in the decision-making process. In recent years, thanks to the work of international institutions and various national governments, we made substantial progress in investigating how we can introduce well-being in decision-making process. This is a table produced in a report by the OECD, by Mahoney in 2023, where she documented how the various initiatives to measure well-being around the world have increased over time. And for instance, here in 2017, we had Luxembourg with our PBNet. Comparatively, we've made relatively less progress instead in understanding what are the conditions that can make economic growth for well-being. These initiatives, the frameworks for well-being, introducing well-being in a decision-making process is important, and most likely are a necessary conditions in order to adopt better policies. But we still need evidence on which policies we need to adopt in order for policymakers to improve humans' well-being. And here is an example of what it means in practice to prioritize well-being in decision-making. For instance, I've been trying to make the case that we should reduce inequalities. Why? Because by reducing inequalities, we could weaken social comparisons and protect social capital. What can we do to reduce inequality? Introduce progressive taxation, introduce minimum wages, provide universal basic services, and in general, public services. I mentioned investing in social relations because social relations increase for well-being, promote resilience, and favor the ability to cooperate to address collective issues. Can we even target social relations as a policy? Well, yes, We can invest in safe and walkable public spaces, because having the infrastructure where we can walk safely is a precondition for us to meet each other and to get to know each other. Promote public transport. In UK, they've introduced social prescribing as a way to address mental health problems. And there is evidence showing that social prescribing is an effective tool to help people with mental health issues. Support local communities, civic associations, and participatory institutions. Introduce volunteering programs for elderly and young people. These are just some ideas that can be done just to target social relations directly. Improve work environments. We spend a lot of time on the workplace, so we can take this is important to improve social relations. It helps working better, reduce stress and turnover. What can we do? Well, reduce working time is one, but we could reduce individual incentive in favor of teamwork. We could favor employee participation in decision making, empower employees and provide autonomy, and so on and so forth. I just wanted to give you an idea of possible policies that would be inspired by targeting well-being directly without pointing to growth and then eventually coming back on well-being. The last point that I want to make is that it's important that these policies are part of a systemic approach to reforming societies. Cherry picking one specific policy risks to backfire, because if it's not part of a generalized movement towards a different way of making policies, well, we do not really change the incentives that make people take decisions. And so it could backfire. So we need really to adopt a program that tackles various aspects. The last point with which I want to leave you is that by prioritizing people's well-being, we now know that we could start a virtuous cycle that would eventually benefit the environment and social relations. Why? Because by reducing inequalities, we could reduce social comparisons, which are an important engine of consumption. By favoring social capital, we increase the ability to cooperate and to work together to address collective problems, which could all benefit the society. We know that in general, this will benefit well-being, so we will have happier people in greener and more sociable environments, which are conducive to higher well-being. And happier people have a number of desirable outcomes. They tend to live longer and healthier lives, which could be good for the sustainability of public budgets in aging societies. They are more productive, and we could use the productivity returns from higher well-being to finance policies for well-being, which could be early retirement, which could be the infrastructure for social relations, which could be supporting volunteering initiatives. And this might contribute to a happier society, but also a richer society, one that perhaps does not grow as much as we, as traditional economists, would think, but one that is better organized to improve quality of life. And with this, I conclude. So the point that I tried to deliver was that subjective well-being should be the primary objective in decision-making. Economic growth is a tool for better lives, not the end, and therefore we better focus on well-being and then see what happens. And how we achieve growth matters. So a different way to work, a different way to organize our lives can lead to better outcomes, better relation between growth and well-being. And I hope that at least I entice some of you to join the research effort to advance thriving lives in social and environmentally sustainable societies. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Francesco. And to the audience, please feel free to raise your virtual hands or to write in the chat. It's nice if you can speak up. We've got a couple of comments already. Joe Sergi says this is inspirational, and you have a whole bunch of claps. As I think you can.
Thank you.
Which is quite nice. But I encourage you, ask challenging questions. What's he missing? And I think I have just my own curiosity. I'll start. I'm thinking about social capital as a win-win. So when we increase social capital, it has a direct relationship on well-being, but it also seems to improve the system. So it increases cooperation, which can then feed back in. Income inequality, I feel like, affects subjective well-being more directly by, say, reducing social comparisons. But do you think it has the same win-win type impact as social capital does? And so does it trigger the virtuous cycle in the same way that investing in promoting social capital does? And also maybe what's the relationship between the two, income inequality and social capital?
Well, we know that the relation between income inequality and well-being is controversial, and there are studies showing that higher income inequality is bad for well-being, and studies contradicting this. I think that so I do not take any strong stance whether it's good or not directly. I think that it can have at least some channels through which it hampers well-being. And one of those channels is, especially when inequality is very high, it may harm the establishment of, it can harm social cohesion, which ultimately I intend as the ability of a society to come together to address collective issues. And then when a society becomes a collection of individuals, it becomes extremely difficult to manage, it becomes extremely difficult to steer. I'm thinking about evidence from recent evidence from the COVID-19 period, when we saw that countries where social capital was higher were better able to handle the pandemic. And so to the extent, and this is largely because these were better able to coordinate their work. People were, ourselves have contributed a study where we show that trust facilitates compliance with public policy, so it makes for better citizens. So in general, I think the relation between trust and between inequality and well-being is controversial, but at least there are some clear channels through which it's harmful, because it harms social relations. Then there is also the issue of levels. If inequality is too high, it could be associated with undesirable outcomes like criminality, violence, and force people to live behind fenced walls, which are not conducive to higher well-being.
Thank you. So Nuno, we have a question from you. You can go ahead. And Ole, I encourage you also, after Nuno goes, to unmute yourself. But Nuno, please feel free to go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Always astonishing presentations and the work produced. I want to ask you if I understand that inequality is something that is very relevant for the relation between growth and well-being. But at some point you talk about quality of growth and the relevance of organization of economic activity. Of course, you can look to this organization of economic activity through the lens of decreasing or increasing inequality. So my first question is, how can we conceive a better organization of economic activity that is related also with inequality, but can also not be related directly with inequality, for having a quality of growth that will increase well-being? The second question is about the well-being policies, because for sure, but could be a question that the welfare state will be the main actor for these well-being policies. But at a certain point in real life, the way of increasing these well-being policies in decision making will be at some point related with this organization of economic activity. So my question is, how decision making should be built in order to have these well-being policies, and at the same time having a specific type of organization of economic activity that, of course, will not disrupt the quality, the GDP growth, or even the social hills that we know that could could harm this process? I don't know if I was clear in my question, but thank you.
It's a great question, Nuno. And it's difficult to answer in just a few minutes. But in general, how I would organize the work so that it contributes to well-being and does not increase inequality. For instance, I would try to leverage more on cooperation, even in the form in which we organize companies. For instance, social enterprises are a form of economic organization that does not prioritize the sharing of profits. Actually, once they repay their debts, they reinvest the surplus into the activities of the company. You could also prioritize companies that target the social and environmental issues over the production of new goods and services. And here I'm really thinking about for instance, there are mechanisms that make the economy run, but are not necessarily, and are producing new goods and services, but do not necessarily improve well-being. I'm thinking about planned obsolescence. I'm thinking about advertisement, especially advertisement targeted to children. These are all mechanisms that are meant to stimulate consumption without, however, necessarily satisfying any fundamental need. And I would say this kind of mechanisms should be kept at bay, and they can be kept at bay through legislation. So there are some initiatives that can be taken at institutional level through laws, and there are some mechanisms that can be adopted in our daily lives, in the places where we work, in the way we organize our work or the education. So this is for the first point. The second point is how do we make decision makers to build, how do we to have well-being policies? I think that we all want the same thing, to live better lives. The problem is that we disagree on how we get there. I think that we're doing a lot of work in order to show the benefits that this approach can bring to inform a different way of doing of taking decisions. And I also believe that thanks to the initiative of the OECD, we now have also systematic knowledge on how to include well-being in the decision-making process. So, and I see that many countries, at least among the OECD member states, have been adopting frameworks to introduce well-being decision-making process. So there is interest. The European Union has been financing research projects, has been putting substantial amount of money into financing this kind of research. So I think that the will is there. We need, on one hand, to provide more concrete policy advices. We need to provide also more precise policy evaluation of various instruments, which means we need to be able to run experiments as well. And then, well, I believe this is a good starting point. Then we will see where we get from there. I will stop it here.
Thank you. Actually, part of your answer, I think, leads well into Ole's question. Ole, feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Thank you so much, first of all, for the presentation and everything. No, for me, I was with all the perspective of increasing the well-being and having like also the production in our society, the Western society in particular, about the profit maximization of like the companies producing to create profit and the mechanisms of selling you something for you to consume something. And for me, there came then the question, like, how is this kind of production, because there's economical growth and everything, not aligning with the well-being of the people? Because technically, like, the better we are producing for the needs of the people, this would also then increase. So, and I saw, for example, the new policy of China with the new five-year plan was like that they wanted to increase the domestic production, and they don't have like an measured measurable goal of like we want to have like 5% of GDP growth per year, for example, for the next 5 years. So for me, it's like, can we apply this also maybe like in the Western society, similar of like having more producing again for the needs of the people instead of having like the profit maximization approach that we are running in the current capitalist approach, neoliberal approach that we are running here right now. So.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Ole, and great to meet you. We totally can. There is no obstacle, and in a certain sense, adopting dashboard of indicators rather than GDP as the sole measure of performance is already a good step in that direction, because it sheds light on specific other indicators that we should monitor. The problem is then how we do this. There is the problem of proliferation of indicators. There is the problem of cherry-picking indicators. There is also the problem that GDP has the big advantage that it's highly standardized, rather easily comparable across countries and over time, and it's a single number, which is very impactful. And when we work with dashboards, all these advantages become shaky. So we need to work, we need to find a solution. In a paper that we're writing, Kelsey, me and others, we're arguing for the use of dashboards of indicators, a small number of indicators, but also to use subjective well-being as a headlight indicator, so that as a synthetic measure that then we can compare or we can monitor. There was one last point I wanted to add to this. Let me think if it comes back about the dashboard of indicators. Small number of indicators. Oh, I'm sorry. I lost what else I wanted to add to this, but I hope you got the sense that yes, the possibility is there. The other thing is that we need to provide the knowledge on how we can synthesize these. How can we select a sufficient number of indicators that can be then monitored?
Thank you. Mag, if you'd like, I can call on you, or I'll read out your question. So feel free to unmute yourself or take a look here. That's a fairly short question, so I'll go ahead. You can see it there, I think, or maybe not. The relationship between trust, GDP growth, and equality. I wonder if the results would be similar if you were to look into some African countries.
I think so, because my experience of African countries is of highly unequal societies that live, if not segregated, largely behind fenced societies, which require huge investment to protect individual safety and property. So these are good societies. Actually, these are societies where this relation would hold. The difference is that there are also those countries that have most to benefit from expanding their economies, because they're starting from very low levels, and therefore, in their case, an increase in GDP has higher probability to increase individuals' well-being, much higher than in developed countries. But also in those cases, if economic activity happens by destroying social relations, it will not improve people's well-being. That's my experience. That's my understanding of what is going on in Africa.
Thank you. So we just have a couple of more minutes left. Please feel free to raise your hand. We have a question from Sean Fay, who is unable to ask himself. So I'll read out. When we observe that people feel their income or wealth still falls short of meeting their needs, how would you distinguish between unmet basic needs and a demand driven by social comparison and status competition? There's two questions, but maybe we'll do one at a time.
Can you repeat, please?
Yes. He's making a distinction between demand for basic needs and demand for social comparison, status competition. And let's see, how would you distinguish between these two? Is it possible to distinguish between these two?
Well, there have been attempts to do this in the literature, and one is also recently done by Fong Yu in a paper on Journal of Happiness Studies, if I'm not mistaken, and then more recently in a paper that that is under review. So there are attempts made through surveys to identify conspicuous consumption and separate it from basic needs. These are imperfect attempts. The one that comes to my mind is based on the work by Heffitz, if I'm not mistaken, where he basically used the answers to a survey where they asked to individuals to rank various goods, the visibility of various goods to others. So they asked, for instance, how visible is the brand of cigarettes that you smoke? How visible is the brand of the underwear you're wearing? And based on this, they build an index. And so they define social conspicuous consumption based on how visible is this good. And in a recent paper from you and I show that the importance of the association between conspicuous consumption and individual well-being is lower in individuals with richer social lives, which basically mimic the result I showed during the presentation, indicating that social comparison and social capital are substitutes in well-being, but also indicates that people that have richer social lives need to consume less conspicuously than others.
Great. Nice that it ties in Feng Yu's work as well. He has a follow-up or another question. So what clear decision rules or thresholds would you use to choose between continuing to pursue a degree of growth, especially given the composition of GDP across consumption and output, or shifting towards a selective degrowth or structural contraction and reallocation?
I don't advocate for degrowth, and I wouldn't put any threshold. What I advocate for is to shift the attention from prioritizing economic growth at all costs, read the recent policy for rearmament, for instance, towards prioritizing well-being, adopt policies that target well-being directly. We have already some evidence of what we need to do. We need some more evidence, and we are working with it. Luckily, we have a flourishing community that is actively working on this. But let's start fixating on economic growth, and let's start instead prioritizing people's lives. There is a lot of advantages on focusing on subjective well-being as a target of decision-making. Subjective well-being is relatable to individuals. When you tell people how satisfied you are with their life, they understand what you mean. While if you ask them about GDP, inflation, exchange rates, they are at a loss. When you aggregate subjective well-being in a country and over time, you're basically making everyone count one. Netto weighting schemes, okay, but this is another statistical issue. So it's democratic and it's not paternalistic, because you're not telling people what is that matters in their life. You're letting them choose what they put into that subjective well-being answer. This means that political debates that focus on well-being can get closer to individuals. And this could be revolutionary, considering the post-democratic days we are living in, and the tendency to authoritarian regimes that we are facing. So a bit more democracy wouldn't be bad.
As you know, I agree. Any other questions, comments? Anyone from online? Otherwise, I think we'll shut it down. Francesco, any last comments for us?
It was lovely to exchange with you today. Thank you a lot for participating, and I look forward to seeing you at the next episode of Measuring Progress.